Welcome to the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm excited because we have Hannah Otto with us today. Hannah, competitive cyclist, she's racing for Scott Bikes, all the great things. We're going to talk about your Unbound. We're also going to talk about some questions that we got on athletes about fatigue resistance, durability. We're going to talk about Leadville and Cadence. We're going to talk about keeping power on the flats versus the climbs. Lots of good stuff and even some bonus if we can get to it. But first things first, it's Tour de France week. If you're listening to this, I think you're 1 day away from the tour starting once this goes live. I'm doing podcast math, so it's probably really bad. But I want to go over some stats really quick, some fun stuff. And you can head over to our YouTube channel to check out a video that's going to visualize a lot of this for you. But the tour, it's 21 days, as always. There are 2 rest days, but there is something weird with that first rest day, which we'll go over in just a bit. It's 2,074 miles or 3,338 kilometers. That's the same distance as LA to Atlanta here in the United States or Madrid to Moscow, which is massive, puts it in perspective. They climb 172,000 feet or 172,244 feet or 52,500 meters. That's nearly 6 Everests. It's 5.9, so close. But here's the funny thing. The first rest day isn't until after stage 10. Isn't that wild, Hannah? Like 10 days in a row. And
You're
then the second
basically
one,
halfway there.
yeah, I know. You're halfway through. And the second one is like, it comes after just a 5-day block. But that 5-day block has 2 mountain stages, and it also has an individual time trial sandwiched between those. That's a hill climb time trial. There's 2 time trials this year, no team time trial, just individual time trials, which is going to be pretty interesting to see. And it's going to favor a rider like Remco, at least on the flat one, but we'll have to see if he gets the jersey at some point. That might be kind of tough for him. Anyways, I looked into a lot of data on this, and I'm going to leave a lot of this data for the video that you need to go watch on our Instagram or YouTube channels. If you're watching this on YouTube right now, it would really help if you give it a thumbs up, then watch it through to the end. If you want to tune it out, just mute it, let it play. That'll help YouTube send it to more cyclists. So, but most Grand Tour contenders that are actually going for the GC, they average somewhere between 0.8 to 0.82 IF for 23 hours for that week. And then if you do that by 3 weeks, I think last year's time was 83 hours, 38 minutes and something seconds. That's what Tade did over the 3 weeks. So that's a wild, thinking of like averaging 0.8 IF. I know that there's this theory that like out there, the tour is like largely kind of like fingers in the nose until it's not with Grand Tours. There's a lot of people that say that. And some stages are easier. And keep in mind, these are also like the GC contenders. So it's probably different than what a sprinter is going to see with their power data or an all-rounder or whatever it might be. But with all that in mind, that's pretty crazy. And an athlete like Tade, assuming like the numbers are correct, that'd be 101,000 kilojoules. So you can go see the video and we share a bunch of different fun things about this. But I just want to share this. If he was to fuel the entire effort and just try to zero out his calories with just dino nuggets, that would be 2,025 dino nuggets. It'd be $323.93. Of course, that would be horrendous fueling because cyclists don't want a bunch of fat and protein. So instead, they go toward gels and all that other stuff. But here's the crazy thing. Let's say that you were to fuel it with like Never Second C30 gels. That would be $3,000 worth of gels, 844 gels that he would have to fuel with over the course of that ride.
Can you imagine having all of that in a suitcase? I wonder what it weighs.
I'm just thinking about the whole team. Like, imagine being the team like that. Like, you know, that's Tade. He doesn't burn as many calories as somebody bigger on the team, like, you know, Mark Soler or something. Like, they're going to be even more. And when you start to look at that, just the nutrition budget alone for the tour is crazy. Like it gets so expensive, and that's just the gel budget.
And
you know?
It's so important because you're talking about day over day, the cumulative effect. Like if you go out on a 4-hour ride from fueling and hydration alone, start to finish, you could be 3+ pounds lighter. And if you don't refuel that or replenish that until the next day, you'll be a little lighter and then a little lighter and then a little lighter. And someone going for GC cannot afford that. Like that will impact performance. And so especially thinking about 10 days until their first rest day, which is an opportunity to maybe burn less calories, get in more fuel, they're having to be so on top of both nutrition and hydration. It's pretty remarkable.
What a backwards paradigm to what the world's average people think, like, oh, can't wait, a day where I burn less calories.
Exactly.
It's such a different perspective. The other crazy thing about this too is that, like you said, Hannah, if you get behind this year, it's a very traditional Tour de France like schedule, in the sense that the third week is where the majority of the very hard stuff is. Like, and that's going to be, if you get behind, it's really, really tough. So it's going to be really interesting. I go into that video like what his caloric deficit would still be if he fueled at like 120 grams per hour. And it is staggering when you think of it. Now, I know they're eating off the bike too, but it just puts into perspective how many calories they actually have to take in on and off the bike to be able to keep it going. The women's race is going to be July 26th to August 3rd. It's 9 stages this year, which is a huge change. This is like, I can't think of YouTube people in the YouTube comments point out other stage races that are 9 days long. And that's like, you don't get a rest day in the 9 days. So like 9 days is a long time to race. Usually it's like a 7-day stage race will be like a quote short world tour stage race. That would be really long for us amateurs. But like a 7-day stage race. And then after that, it just jumps up to the Grand Tours. This is a weird, like in between. It's interesting. It's 724 miles, the women's Tour de France Femmes, I should say. It's 724 miles, 1,165 kilometers. That's the same distance as San Francisco to Salt Lake City or Paris to Berlin. They're going to climb 17,231 meters or 56,532 feet. So nearly 2 Everests. The brutal stage 8 that they have has a higher climb to distance ratio than most mountain stages in men's Grand Tours. It's a lot. It's really tough. And then all 3 mountain stages come at the end, meaning the GC contenders will need to focus on like preservation, because it starts out with 2 hilly stages, 2 sprint stages, like flat stages, then 2 hilly stages, and then you hit the mountains. So that's going to be really interesting to see. I'm assuming a finishing time somewhere around 30 hours for the winner, and assuming Demi Vollering's numbers, which I'm just guessing here because she is statistically the favorite at 40% compared to Kasia, who is at 30%, Anna van der Breggen at 15%, and then the rest thereon from there. But when I look at what she would have to burn to do that, if the numbers are correct, which they're just guesses, I think, on the internet, but it'd be 26,000 calories. It's 46 Big Macs, or 518 Dino Nuggets, or 99 hot dogs, or 247 bananas. Can you imagine how sick of bananas you would be? 104 Snickers, or 236 Red Bulls. You'd probably have a heart attack. 185 cans of Coke, or 216 gels, or 144 Never Second C90 packets, if you're going to use that. It's a lot of stuff to fuel when you think about it. So it's going to be an incredible race. I'm really curious to see how that one shakes down with Van der Breggen back and on the same team and as Vollering, all that stuff. It'll be interesting to see. So it'll be great. Should we get into the questions, Hannah?
Let's do it.
All right. Dan sent in a question, said, "Help, will my lower cadence sink my chance for a belt buckle finish at Leadville? I'm a devoted listener to the podcast and a TrainerRoad subscriber. Long story short, I missed getting a belt buckle by 4 minutes and 30 seconds in 2024. Ooh, that stings. A day before the race, I woke up with a fever, and what I learned after was I rode the race with COVID and strep throat. I'm coming back in 2025 for redemption, but I'm concerned that my body's preference for a slower cadence, usually around 70 to 75 on a ride, will create a problem for me. I'm currently riding the 2023 S-Works Epic World Cup with a 34 tooth in the front. Can you look at my training history and give me suggestions on what to do to work on improving cadence, and should I go to a 32 tooth in front? Or will that be a problem with my slower cadence? Thanks in advance for answering my questions and for all the guidance you provide for all of us average Joes." I'll add Janes to that too. Okay, Dan, forgive me. I ran through, and I'm going to share out some numbers really quick here. 3.4 watts per kilogram is Dan's power to weight ratio at a 287 watt FTP. That means 84 kilograms or 186 pounds. Average training elevation is about 700 feet, so 200 meters. Leadville is decidedly not 700 feet or 200 meters. So in this case, I ran the numbers, and this is an estimate. This isn't exact. I didn't do any sort of like reverse engineering trying to refine it and everything else, but this is just an estimate. But Best Bike Split estimates that you would need to do somewhere around 211 average power, 219 normalized power to go sub 9. And it has your average speed on the flats being about 15 miles per hour and your slowest climb speed being 2.3 miles per hour. That's at the top of Columbine and then also on Powerline. The thing to keep in mind is that Best Bike Split has no clue about traction. And that's like the challenge, right, Hannah? It's not just that it's steep, it's that you're trying to also like take the right line, manage an off camber that's also loose, and if you lose traction at any point, you're done. So it's like it's a bit different, right?
It becomes a full body workout on Columbine and Powerline because you're really engaging your core to, one, stay upright when you're talking about such slow speeds, and then also, like you're saying, to maintain the proper pressure on the pedals to adjust your body constantly according to where you feel it slipping. And a lot of people, when they're at that point and in under that much fatigue and load, every extra muscle you're engaging hurts. Like to engage your core at that point, most of us are breathing through our eyes and just feel kind of like a floppy noodle. So yes, that is a major element.
Yes. It estimates that your fastest pedaling speed will be around 26 miles per hour. So I ran some numbers here on gearing and what your lowest speed would be at certain RPMs and your highest speed would be at certain RPMs. Okay, so this is, and I'm really pushing it low here, but 40 RPM is the lowest that I would say that you can probably maintain for a short period of time. And for you, normally I would say like 100 RPM for people, but for you, since you average somewhere around 70 to 75, I'm going to say 90 RPM is probably the highest you would want to be. And that probably isn't sustainable for you if you're not used to it. So if you have a 30-tooth chain, and assuming you also have like a 1052 cassette, if you have a 1051, then all of this shifts, like the bottom, the lowest speed isn't quite as high. But if you have a 1052 and you have a 30-tooth up front, that means that the slowest you can pedal at 40 RPM is 2 miles an hour. If you have a 32-tooth, that's 2.1 miles an hour. If you have a 34-tooth, it's 2.3 miles an hour. Now, the fastest you'd pedal, or fastest you'd go if you're pedaling at 90 RPM in your 10, is 23.2 miles an hour with a 30-tooth. With a 32-tooth, it's going to be 24.8. And with a 34, it's going to be 26.3. So here's some things to remember. Your speed, the slowest speed that I anticipate seeing is going to be somewhere around 2.3 miles per hour. If you look at that, a 34-tooth should fit very well because also the fastest pedaling speed that I would see. What I mean is you're not going to be pedaling down Columbine the whole way, but you'll be pedaling through rollers and that sort of thing. And in those situations, it's saying around 26 miles per hour. So that shows that like the 34-tooth would be ideal. But it's really important to think about 40 RPM. 40 RPM is really slow. It's nothing that you want to maintain for a long time. And I know I see people getting like drugged down there, but at the same time, 60 RPM is probably a bit more of like a relatable point for a lot of people. And it's going to help you balance better, keep better traction, that sort of thing. And at 60 RPM, if you have a 30-tooth on there, the slowest you can go is 3 miles an hour. The slowest you can go with a 32-tooth is 3.2, and with a 34, it's 3.4. So while I know the 34 might seem ideal on the numbers, having done this race before, and I think I did it with a 30 or a 32, it was going up Powerline. I still spun out at a point, and I had to get off, and I had to walk for 15 feet or something and get back on. So, and that was with an FTP around 300 at that point. And so it's like a higher FTP than also significant. Like I was down around 150 pounds, 145 pounds. So
you also have to ask yourself where the most critical part in the race is going to be for you. If you end up being spun out on one of the flats because there's a tailwind and you can only go 24 miles per hour instead of 26 because you don't have a hard enough gear, is that more harmful than being so fatigued that you can't turn over at 40 RPMs and you have to get off and walk? Minute for minute, you're probably losing more walking, and also you're saving your legs. Like if you go a little slower on those flats, you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I'm bleeding time. But you can also rephrase it as, I'm saving myself. I'm recovering. And then use that on the climbs when honestly, that's the place where you can make up the most time.
So well said, Hannah. The same logic here applies to groups, especially at Leadville. People are like, oh, I lost that group, my day's over. It's like, well, actually, if you were with that group, you were riding over your head anyway.
Mm-hmm.
You were going to implode. And you're going to be faster in the end if you hold your pace that you can sustain. I honestly would advocate, Dan, in this case, I would advocate for running the 30 tooth. I know that seems lower, but that's likely going to help you more because the reality is best bike split doesn't take into account, and it can't. It's not like any fault of its own, but it can't take into account all of the texture variables that you're going to have to the overall profile of the day. There's a lot of those. And then the fitness things. And then you're going to hit a low point out there at some point. It's such a long and difficult day. And in that low point, wouldn't you love to have a safety net instead of thinking like, I need to optimize for the fastest speed and center of the cassette and all that? Like, look, if you're going for the course record and if you're Hannah, they're making those decisions with a very different set of consequences, circumstances, and like goals than somebody like us. I know you're really shooting for your big buckle time, which is sub 9 hours, but at the same time, like you have to recognize the fact that you probably need to build insurance in rather than trying to push yourself to the ragged edge. And so I would advocate for the 30.
And talking about insurance, that even if you're sitting there thinking, no, I got this, valid. What I would add to that is, but you are also at the mercy of other people. And so that safety net isn't just for you and your fatigue and anticipating you being tired. It's for when you're going up Columbine on the goat trail and the person right in front of you all of a sudden gets off and stops. If you have that extra gear, you might be able to maneuver around. If you're at 40 RPMs, you are stopping with them. And so this does give you flexibility to also work with the circumstances that you're going to be dealt out there.
Yeah, completely agree. For context, so Hannah, when people listen to this podcast, the next week in 2 weeks from that, I am doing Tahoe Trail 100. I have this crazy moonshot goal. If everything somehow goes amazingly well, and other people probably have terrible days, I might actually get like a Leadville qualifying time. And that would be cool. I'm already planning on going to Leadville, but I was planning on bringing my son there, and my dad's never been, and I wanted to bring him so then they can just like experience it because it's an iconic event. Mm-hmm. But if I'm gonna I was like, well, I might as well try, and we'll see if I can qualify again and give it a shot. I'm right now, I actually just yesterday, almost identical FTP to this person, 286 is what AI FTP detection gave me. Now I'm not at 84 kilograms. I guess what is my weight right now? 153, 2 kilograms. I'm at 69 kilograms right now. So I'm like lighter than that, but around the same FTP. And for I'm considering running a 30 or maybe even a 32, but like maybe even a 30 for that race. So I've done that before, and honestly, I didn't, at the top of Columbine, I wasn't like, this is so great, I have so many gears. And Powerline, I was just like, how can I have a 78 tooth rear cog? It's so hard. So hopefully that gives you kind of some context on what the mechanical constraints here that you could be dealing with. I do recommend going with a 30 tooth. You'll be fine. All of that. Now, let's get into the physiological side, Hannah, because this is the other side. And I did look through your training in this case, Dan. Looked at a lot of different stuff. Like, yes, you do typically carry a lower cadence than what I'd see, but you also, it's because of like when you are on climbs or anything else, it seems like whereas most people might shift more early and that sort of a thing, you kind of like let it sit. And then you also do carry like slightly lower in other situations, but it's not worth you. We aren't that far away from Leadville. Like we're just under a month away. So if you try to flip yourself 180 degrees right now going into Leadville, that might be it's like a change that you don't want to make leading into something so big right now, I would say. But Hannah, it's probably good for us to like understand more like what's going on when you're riding at a high cadence versus a low cadence and why you might want to shift it a little bit higher in this case.
Yeah, this to me is sort of the trying to convince you portion of this answer. So I feel like Jonathan just went through all the reasons why you should run the smaller chainring. And now I hope that this information convinces you to do that, which is essentially what's happening when you're operating at a lower cadence is you're encountering a higher muscular load. So lower cadences place more demand on those fast twitch muscle fibers, even if you're not doing like VO2, even if you're doing zone 2 or tempo or all of those speeds that you'll be doing at Leadville, it's still more demand on those fast twitch fibers, which when we also take into account what Leadville is, that's not really what we want to be working at that high of elevation. We want to be staying as aerobic as possible. So we want to stay with those more slow twitch fibers, fueling them with as much oxygen as possible. It's also, because you're using those fast twitch fibers, it's going to be, like I said, more muscular load in general. So you're going to have higher fatigue mounting over time. So while it might feel okay for some of your shorter rides, this means you will be fatiguing your muscles at a greater rate and potentially hurting more at the end of a race. This is why sometimes you might hear or even see, if you watch a lot of racing, people spinning at higher cadences at the start of races. I think all the way back to some of my triathlon days when they talk a lot about in triathlon, like spin at a high cadence, because then they're going out to the run. So they want to limit the muscular load as much as possible. This is, again, really important for Leadville because it is such a long race. Also, you are going to be forced into those lower cadences many of times during Leadville. And so in some ways, you actually want to save that muscular load for the times you have to use it. So the good news for you is it might be less of a shock to your body on Powerline and Columbine than some people who never train those like low cadence drills that you see some people doing. You might excel in those areas just because you're used to it. You want, though, to try your best on the flats to not use up all of that muscle energy that you have so that when you get there, you're so fatigued. So like Jonathan said, this is a big change. It's really hard to change something like this. It is worth it, though. So this is something that probably in your off season, I would take some time to work on. That said, this is not the reason you won't reach the belt buckle. You were already so incredibly close and you were sick. Like, get that out of your mind. You totally got this. Are you making it a little harder on yourself? Yes, you are. But you've already trained this way. You've already got to the place that you're at with this. And so there's no reason you can't accomplish your goal in spite of this. And I would also then look at this as a really exciting thing because we get a lot of questions about, am I at my physiological limit? Have I reached my maximum? And here is something that you already know, that if you improve this, you can be better in the future. And so I would take this as, oh my goodness, I've uncovered this huge area of opportunity. And if I take the time in the off season to fix it, what if you get the belt buckle this year and then you're even faster next year because you make this change? That's super exciting. So I wouldn't worry about changing it now, but it is a nice thing, I think, to have in your head of, like I said, on those flats, if you're used to operating at 70 RPMs, we do not flip the script. Don't do 90 RPMs. That will be such a shock to the system. But keep in mind, can you shift one gear easier, just one, and do 75 instead of 70? That will still make a significant difference.
I asked three different riders, and looked at my own data too, if they had lower cadences at Leadville compared to what they typically have. And 3 out of 4 athletes did, 1 did not. Those 3 athletes, there was somewhere around 5 to 10 RPM, somewhere within that range that was lower. I had lower cadence too. That's for a couple of reasons. Like, number one, you're up at elevation. As a result, there's less available oxygen, which means that your body's like aerobic ceiling drops effectively. So that means that your muscles, to produce energy aerobically, which, like we talked about with slow twitch fibers, that's what they're really good at. They can do that all day. But if they're capped and you're not able to utilize that, what you end up doing is you do end up relying, your cadence does shift down a little bit, because shifting high has more oxygen demand in a lot of cases. So then, you kind of drift a little bit low, but then also it's because you spend so much time on these super long, steep climbs. That's likely the much more profound factor here of Columbine and Powerline in particular. They take a long time and you're at a low cadence with that. But you have to think about this. If it's going to be an 8-hour day, and at Leadville, I looked back at my data. So I had 46 minutes of coasting on descents total at Leadville, which is crazy. It's way more than I would have thought. Like, in my mind, I didn't feel like I was coasting for 46 minutes. But I had 46 minutes of coasting on descents, and then 20 accumulated minutes otherwise than that. And that's like if I stop pedaling for a second, that sort of a thing. That's when that happened. So the start probably took care of like a decent chunk of that when you're rolling down into town. That 20 minutes accumulated over the course of 8 hours and 14 minutes, which was my time, that's actually like you're not intentionally coasting at any point. That's just going to add up over that time course. So that is a long time overload, like where your body is just like your muscles are under tension for a really, really long time. So that's why this is really important, what Hannah's talking about here. When you switch to those fast twitch muscles, they want to use a lot of glycogen. That's like what they're best at. And they get worn out really fast. They get damaged really fast. They need to spend time recovering. And as a result, like, it's just, if you dip too far into those, it's going to be really tough. And that low cadence just always pushes you further on the spectrum. The teeter-totter tilts a little bit more toward the less efficient side. So great. Great advice, Hannah. An extra tip here. If you do what Best Bike Split says is somewhere around 230 to 240 on climbs and somewhere around 200 to 210 on flats, Dan would get you the big belt buckle time. So there's some kind of like some points you can shoot for there. So.
And notice that the power is a little lower on the flats. So hopefully that also gives you the bandwidth to pedal in a little bit softer gear. I know that sometimes when we're tired and we're trying to mash on the flats, that's when you can get super bogged down and overgeared. You don't need to do that. You can go slightly easier on these flats and really crush the climbs.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. If you do happen to find a group, hallelujah, that's wonderful if they're carrying like your pace and you don't have to surge over your targets. But boy, if they get you to surge over your targets, then I'd drop them real quick. So speaking of big races, Hannah, can we talk about Unbound really quick?
Yeah.
Your Unbound looked like you went to hell and back. Like, it looked like it was such a hard day for you.
It was a journey.
You didn't throw in the towel. You kept going. So I maybe like a quick recap of like what went down, but then I kind of want to dive a little bit deeper into the mental struggle. Perhaps like the things that caused the struggle, but then also how you wrestled with this and decided to go through with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy with my Unbound. And I think that's important for people to hear, because it's important to understand that when you line up for a monster race like this, it is so long that with every mile you add on, the chances of something going not the way you want it to increase pretty much exponentially the longer that it goes. And so, upon reflection, standing on that start line, we all have these hopes and dreams and imagining of what could be on the day. And the reality is most of us will face enormous challenges. And so when you think of Unbound, for most everyone there, aside from the person who has that magic day and gets to cross that finish line first, We instead have the opportunity to see how far we can push ourselves. And that is the beauty of this race. And I think the importance also in that is to come out the other side with a new understanding of what you can do. And I feel like that's something that I got out there, and I'm really grateful for that. So a little recap on my day was the day did start pretty aggressive for us women. A couple people went off the front early, and I actually remember taking note of who they were and thinking, oh, well, I beat them because it's such an audacious move. Spoiler alert, that was the move that won. But what's also funny is since it was a sprint finish the year before, I knew it was going to play out much differently because no one wanted that again. Even though it was fun, no one wanted that again.
People learn,
I
right?
Just didn't
they learn,
think,
apply.
Yeah, I just didn't think the move would go at mile 20. But essentially, because of that, the main group ended up in sort of a weird situation where we needed to chase, but no one was willing to do that work because it put you on the back foot of having done more work in the group. And the group was big enough that we couldn't quite organize because it seemed that someone always would somehow sneak by not doing the work. And everyone was strong enough that there was no one that we could afford to just say, it's fine, let them do that. And so the main group ended up being a lot of very, very, very hard efforts, like couple minutes, super, super hard. And then everyone easing up and soft pedaling super, super easy.
It's the best way to lose time.
And a very hard way to race 200 miles. This is not what you expect when you line up for that long of a race of doing just basically repeated VO2 efforts. And also because, strategically so, many of these efforts came before the minimum maintenance roads, which meant we were going into these MMRs completely cross-eyed. Many people in desperation mode because they were about to get dropped or getting dropped and trying to hang on and using these single tracks to try and catch up or execute a pass or whatever it might be. And those, if you know Unbound, are the sketchiest moments. So there were a ton of crashes in the first, I would say, 50 miles of the race. I was one of them in the first MMR. 2 women slid out in the mud ahead of me, and there was nowhere to go. They covered the whole trail, and just tapping the brakes to try and avoid them made my front wheel dig into the mud, and I went over the bars straight on my face, got all cut up across the chin, up my cheek, and then got to get back on, untwist my bars, and chase on for the next 10 miles after encountering that crash. And what's funny is in that moment, I thought, oh, this is my challenge of the day. Here we go. This is my challenge. Let's do it. I got this.
Little did you know.
Little did I know. And I caught on around mile 45, 50, somewhere around there. And from there to mile 100, I felt so good. I felt really just like, okay, I'm back, I'm on, I'm ready, this is going to be my day. I felt like everything was actually getting easier for me as the day went on. And then all of a sudden, quite literally out of nowhere, it felt like at mile 110, I just vomited all over myself, all over my bike, my body, my bars. And looking down at all of the vomit all over, I just thought, well, that's new.
It's a good way to assess the situation. I like that. It's very zen, Hannah, to just to observe it with zero moral character. Just like
well, and that's something that I did talk about with Dr. Sarah at Enzo Mental Performance beforehand is, okay, like what challenges am I going to come across? And when they come, how do I approach them? And it's without judgment, right? This is happening whether or not you're happy about it. And so to create that neutral space of, how interesting is really the best thing we can do. Anyways, long story short, I continued to throw up from mile 110 all the way to the finish, about every 5 miles. And so I not like tiny cute, like, oh, I threw up in my mouth. We're talking like projectile vomiting. Shout out to Molly Cameron. I threw up on her in the feed zone when she tried to hand me food.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, like not controllable type of vomit. And it was definitely an exercise of resilience and of controlling what I could. And I mean, for those wondering what happened, essentially the reason this occurred for me on this day was I was trying to push my fueling really high, which is something I had trained and worked on. And also, you have limited fluid carrying capabilities. And also, it was really, really hot. So that 3-way mixture is what got to me. So basically, when you consume really large amounts of carbohydrates, your body needs water to digest that, or fluid to digest that. And if it doesn't have enough fluid, it will take basically like the extracellular fluid out of your body and pull it into the stomach to try and help process that carbohydrate. And so I was taking in huge amounts of carbohydrate and I didn't have enough water to fix it. And so as I was continuing to take down the carbs, which you have to do, I didn't have enough water. I was pulling the water in, dehydrating myself more, vomiting because one, I can't digest these carbs because I don't have enough water, and also vomiting because I'm dehydrated, and then becoming more dehydrated because I'm vomiting. So you can see how this becomes sort of a cyclical issue. And I was even aware of this in the moment and trying to change everything I could to fix it. But again, this is a race. You only get water where you get water. And I was stopping everywhere I could to fill up more. But it was just the way that my race went. It was the fluids that I had planned to be able to carry. And it wasn't enough on the day.
Oh, you had chances where you could have pulled the plug. Why didn't you?
It's a great question. I think these races are a chance to see how far you can go. And it's funny because going into the race, I have the obvious goal of winning, right? Like this is a huge goal. I'm a racer and I think I'm capable of that on my best day. And as that slips away, sometimes you start to ask yourself, well, what would I be happy with today? Would I be happy with top 5? Would I be happy with top 10? And you kind of start to play this game of like, what would I be able to cross the finish line and say I had a good day? And I'll admit I was having these thoughts out there. And what really hit me was the honest fact that I wanted to cross that finish line knowing I had given it everything I had. I wanted to have absolutely no regrets. And I felt total conviction in that process of knowing if I give everything I have today and I can cross the finish line and say, that was the best that I had today. Maybe it didn't go right. Maybe it didn't go smooth. Maybe I made mistakes, but I gave my absolute best despite those mistakes. I can walk away and say, it's a great race. Because I did what I could. And so I was really invested in that process of wringing myself dry, of giving it everything I had. And I felt really rewarded by that in the end. With about 8 miles to go, I had this like continuous vomiting episode where just like one after another where I was like, oh my gosh, I might pass out because you can't really open your eyes also when you're vomiting. So I'm like kind of swerving out.
Yes, true.
And after that, I thought I had this moment where I was like, oh my gosh, like 8 miles to go. I've made it. Just relax. Like you could basically coast it, 8 miles after almost 200 feels like nothing. Like you're like, I'm telling myself like I'm safe, like just make it, you're fine, you can ease up now, don't worry about it. And I started to. And then I had a thought of like, what if this is the moment that gives me regret? And so I stayed on the gas, I pushed to the finish, I crossed the finish line, and like less than 2 minutes later, a pack of 15 girls came in for a sprint finish. And if I had eased up in that moment, I probably would have lost to that group, and you bet I would have had regret for that. And so to me, it's all of these learning experiences of understanding that in that moment, sitting up feels so good, but I've been there enough times to know it's not worth it. Like what is worth it is crossing that finish line knowing I did my best. And you can be proud of that. And I think that's the beauty of Unbound is every single person can probably relate to what I'm saying because it's not about win or lose or placement. It's about those individual battles of crossing the finish line and looking back and looking at your time or looking who you beat or looking at what you overcame and saying, I did that because I didn't quit. And I think that's what's so beautiful about this sport.
Yeah. Well done, Hannah. You, on a particularly hard day, you still got the learnings out of it. And that's like the important thing as a professional athlete, but then all of us average athletes too, is that we just have to, even when you have those terrible days and you say, all right, it's like, what did you learn? Sometimes you learn absolutely nothing about execution in the race, but you learn a whole lot about even just like emotional management and psychological management through struggle, like there's, in your case, you had learnings across the board, on the nutrition side and everything else like that. But if you're listening to this and you've had a hard race, there's not a whole lot of productivity in just like beating yourself up for the race. And instead, there is a lot of productivity in stepping back and trying to learn about how different things are managed, what the outcome was, look at them objectively and look at them as like a 1 + 1 = 2, rather than looking at it like morally bad or morally good. And if you look at it from that perspective, it'll just help you get a lot of value from it.
Absolutely.
Hannah, it's a great example. So Simon sent in a question. This one's going to be a hot take one, a hot button one. He says, how do you train to improve, quote, fatigue resistance? This is the topic du jour, has been for the last year or so. Is this part of TrainerRoad's AI plan builds? Do you need to train this? I race a range of disciplines and durations from crits all the way to XCM. Okay, so we're going to get into fatigue resistance here and kind of explain it because I do think that there's some context wrapped around it that maybe has people misunderstanding what it actually is. Hannah, I kind of want to go deep into like what actually happens and like what are the changes that you're hoping that come about in your body as a result of this. But first things, and then I want to talk about practically training it later. And the first part, though, is fatigue resistance, aka durability. These two things are used interchangeably. Refers to your ability to maintain high power outputs deep into a workout or a race. That's effectively what it could be. I'm sure somebody has a different definition there. For topics du jour, everyone likes to have their own definition on whatever it is. But that's essentially the concept, is that deep into the race you can do more. Here are the key training outcomes that you want to accomplish when you are trying to build fatigue resistance or durability. Number 1, muscle fiber durability. So your slow twitch fibers, their ability to maintain force output under metabolic stress, meaning that those slow twitch fibers, like we talked about earlier, Hannah, these ones love to operate aerobically, right? Once the intensity ramps up, they're like, hey, I tap out. They reach over the WWF ropes and they tap in the fast twitch guys and they jump into the ring all excited to go. But they burn a bunch of resources. They burn a bunch of glycogen, that sort of a thing. And then it brings you back where those are exhausted. And suddenly the dudes that tapped out and are tired outside the ring, they're like, I can't go back in. You can't ask me to do something hard. That's the visual here that we're operating with. So what you're trying to do is build your slow twitch fibers' ability to maintain that force output under metabolic stress. I know that sounds a bit counterintuitive. You're like, well, if they can't maintain it, they can't maintain it. And this is the same concept though with all training, is that what you do is you systematically dose it with a little more than it can have or that it can currently do. and then you let it recover. And in that recovery process, it adapts to prepare itself for that sort of effort again. That's called progressive overload, and that's adaptation. That's what we go for. So another thing that you're trying to go for is glycogen sparing and utilization, which also that makes sense, right? If we're trying to stop these fast twitch fibers from jumping into the ring too early and make it so the slow twitch fibers can stay in there longer, we want to delay that depletion of muscle glycogen, because once that muscle glycogen is gone, it's a lot harder then for your fast twitch fibers and everything else to be able to operate like they should. And again, we just want to be relying on the slow twitch side. So mitochondrial efficiency is another one. And that's again, it's kind of all in the same arena here, but sustaining ATP production despite rising fatigue byproducts. In other words, as you work, as you train, or you're riding at a higher level and the intensity is increasing, you produce lactate and metabolic byproduct like exhaust, and that makes it harder for your body to continually produce ATP at the same rates that it was. And as a result, that's when we get fatigue, like acute fatigue, tired during an interval, right? That's something that's too intense. So you want to make it so that your body can reprocess all of that and be able to handle those byproducts and still be able to produce ATP in those hydrogen-rich, lactate-rich environments that are created. Then on the other side, there's also neuromuscular coordination. It's reducing the loss of your pedal efficiency with tired muscles. Leadville, Unbound, these two examples are great ones where they're big days, and it's easy for you to kind of feel like you've lost your stride and pedaling squares all of a sudden. And then finally, a resistance to central fatigue, I think, is another thing with this as well. So your brain and your nervous system's ability to keep recruiting muscle fibers late in efforts. There's not just the ability to the neuromuscular coordination side, but there's also the clear message pathway from the brain to be hey, keep working like this, and then you'll be doing all right. So those are kind of the main training outcomes. And if you accomplish those training outcomes, then you'll get to the point where you'll be more durable to the end of races. But if you've read Training and Racing with the Power Meter, or any sort of, which if you haven't, not that it's going to be the most entertaining read that you've ever had, but I will say that has withstood the test of time. It's a fantastic and well-measured book to understand training, and I recommend it. But if you've read it before, you've heard of all of those things that I just said, and you're wait a second, isn't that the same outcomes we're going for with training in general? And the answer is yes. Yes, it is. So I think that it's popularly now, fatigue resistance or durability is popularly achieved by doing intervals at the end of a long ride, or through fasted training where you're depleting yourself of glycogen, or through really long, low to moderate intensity rides where your intensity is really controlled. That doesn't look like I might see more rides and more training calendars than anybody else. When you think about it, the amount of training that we look into here at TrainerRoad is astounding, from a lot of different athletes. The vast majority of long rides are not Z2 rides. They do not have the controlled low to moderate intensity that you'd be looking for with this. What these sort of rides look like isn't just noodling around. It's constantly on the gas, but you're never going above tempo at all. Instead, what you're doing is staying in zone 2. That's right around you. You don't want to be going above 75% FTP. You want to be sticking between that 60 to 75, and you don't want to coast. You don't want to have interruptions. You want to be steady and even on that gas. That's what they're talking about when they talk about these long, low, moderate intensity rides. But here's the biggest thing. This is not talked enough about in training, flat out. These long rides, these fasted rides, these rides that are long with intervals at the end, they're hard to do. And people typically have a very low compliance rate with these. People typically have a very low compliance rate with any training. And then what we're doing is we're saying, you know what? Let's make it harder to do. That will make it harder for you to be consistent, but it's going to make you like Tade. And it's going to make you way faster. It's very common that what happens in cycling is that we hear top-level athletes talk about something they're doing, And it's so far away from being practically the best approach for us amateurs. They're worried about marginal gains. Meanwhile, we also get worried about their marginal gains while we ignore our own foundational gains. There's a whole batch of low-hanging fruit that we're just overlooking because we're trying to get something else when we do this. I think that we're missing like the forest through the trees on this. Like there are multiple ways to accomplish fatigue resistance training. It's not just long rides with intervals at the end, not just very long endurance rides with controlled intensity or fasted rides. Will those do it? Absolutely. Are they perhaps an even better way to do it than in other ways? Potentially. However, if you do not have a stable foundation of consistent training, this is putting cherry on top of the saddest sundae you've ever seen. The cherry doesn't make it a great sundae. You need the sundae still. The cherry on top is just the extra little piece. I kind of have some guidelines for people on this. If you're going to be doing like 90-minute or above workouts, and you're doing capacitive efforts at sweet spot threshold or VO2 max, these are incredibly effective at achieving the training outcomes we talked about on this. It's because what it's doing is it's getting you to your limits and then going from there. There's an assumption that interval training is commonly discussed under this context that it's like very short workouts where a person that does interval training avoids anything that's long. And if we're talking about people that are probably doing like high intensity aerobic fitness classes, that might be the case here, but we're dealing with endurance athletes and it's pretty different. It's never discussed always under the context that the high intensity intervals are very well calibrated to achieve progressive overload. And that's a key thing too. So if you are doing greater than 90-minute workouts at capacitive efforts and it's well calibrated, it's part of a well-structured plan where you have like good periodization, you're achieving progressive overload. And it's not just in terms of like TSS with progressive overload, but like if your abilities allow you to do 4x5, then perhaps the next week, you don't just jump up to 5x5, but maybe what you do is you go to 5x3 or something. I don't know. That's what we use AI for, to find the right workout that's like perfectly progressive and it's the right workout that you need. But if it's doing all that, that will accomplish the outcomes that you're looking for. And like particularly if you can tolerate 3 or more 90-minute well-structured workouts per week, if you can't tolerate 3 or more 90-minute structured workouts, then don't worry about any of this. Like just focus on trying to do the 90-minute or the 60-minute or the 30-minute workouts that you need to do before that. That's why we also built the whole tool to be able to build you a customized training schedule to get you to that point. So I think this whole thing like is pretty misunderstood because athletes think that they need to do intervals at the end, or they need to do fasted training, or they need to do something in order to build this novel concept of durability or fatigue resistance. But the reality is any well-structured training plan executed with good compliance gives you the same outcomes. Now, will it give you, or I shouldn't say the same outcomes, it develops the same attributes that you need. It brings about the same adaptations. Does it bring about them to the same degree? Probably not. But if you're an athlete that isn't already optimized to the nth degree, there's no point in trying to optimize further instead of just trying to execute the foundational gains. So to answer Simon's question, like, that's what we do. That's what all good training does. And it will help you in any event that you do for sure. Hannah, I'm sorry, that was a long rant. Do you have thoughts about any of this?
Yeah.
You're one of the people that it does make sense. Your sundae is very well built. It's the best sundae, and now you want to put the cherry on top.
Yeah, I mean, everything you said, I will basically just reiterate in slightly different words, which I basically think it all comes down to the words, it's all relative. So I think fatigue resistance in and of itself has kind of become coined as this very specific type of workout because most of the time what people see is what the pros are doing. And for us, in order to stretch ourselves, we have to do a 5-hour ride with intervals at the end. Because if I do a 2-hour ride with intervals, I'm not inducing enough fatigue. And if I do 5 by 10 minutes at sweet spot, that's not inducing enough fatigue. And so if I do 4 by 20, maybe now that's fatigue resistance. And someone would look at that and say, oh yeah, of course that's fatigue resistance. Look how hard it is. Well, yeah, because it's hard for me. But if 5 by 10 is hard for you, that is also fatigue resistance. You kind of have to go back not to what workouts you've seen as an example of this word, but what is the actual word? You are resisting fatigue. And so if for you, you only ever do 1 hour workouts because that's all the time that you have, a 90-minute or 2-hour Z2 ride is fatigue resistance. Because, like Jonathan's saying, it's progressing you forward. It's overloading your body. You are giving your body a stimulus that it is not used to. Same thing with intervals. If you're used to doing, like he's saying, 3 by 10, and we up it in some way that makes it more than 30 minutes of work, whether it's 4 by 8 or 4 by 10 or whatever that next step might be, that is fatigue resistance. If you always do your intervals and your last 2, you're barely squeaking by and like just a little under the range and not quite meeting it, maybe your fatigue resistance mission is getting all the way through that workout, because clearly at the end of that workout, you are fatigued. And so the goal becomes resisting that fatigue. It doesn't have to look a certain way. It doesn't have to be, oh no, I don't have fatigue resistance in my training because I never ride 5 hours. I guarantee you, if you're following a plan, you do have some level of fatigue resistance. If your workouts feel hard, you're resisting fatigue. If you want to ease up, that is you resisting fatigue by wanting to and not. It just means that over time, as we progress and as we get stronger and as we get more used to these loads, just like any other principle in training, they have to increase. And at a certain point, for pros, it might look kind of gnarly. It might look like 5 hours with intervals at the end. But for anyone who hasn't done that, that's way too much. And quite frankly, probably not even necessary for what your goals are.
Really well said, Hannah. I feel like any coaching panel that exists, and we would love to be a part of these if they exist, any coaching panel that isn't talking practically about training application, in other words, are athletes actually doing the workouts, is an underserved coaching panel. I think that it would be like sailboat designers talking about sailing on perfectly smooth seas and how irrelevant that would be to the actual reality of what a sailboat actually has to go through. We can talk about these principles of like an athlete needs 80-20, 90-10. An athlete needs this amount of time at a specific intensity and this amount of time at another one. And you can talk about it all in this theoretical glassy water landscape. But in reality, real life is messy, and athletes can't execute with that sort of precision all the time. Instead, like, we should always be asking ourselves as athletes and coaches, how can I set myself up as an athlete or setting up a coach? Like, how can I set this person up to be the most consistent possible with their training? That's more valuable many times than finding the exact numbers or anything else.
And I would also challenge that person if someone's looking at their own calendar and saying, no, every time I've had a 5-hour ride or I've had this type of ride, I've done it. I would also challenge you to look at the following days after that ride, because this is something I see a lot, is it is super exciting to do these like Mission Impossible rides, because you do get such a big dose of excitement of, oh my gosh, I did it. And then you're so smashed that a couple of things happen. Either 1, you can't ride because you're too tired. 2, you try to ride, but you can't hit the intervals. Or 3, kind of a mixture, like you kind of do half the rides and you kind of hit some of them and you kind of don't. And then the quote unquote excuse looking back is, oh, well, I was too busy. I had too much going on, which to me, I also wonder, well, is that because your lifestyle didn't really allow you to do that 5-hour ride, and maybe you needed to mow the lawn that day or do meal prep that day or whatever other thing, and now you're backlogged into the week and you can't fit in these 1-hour rides or 90-minute rides that you normally do because you're trying to make up. So it's both, I'm too tired, my body physically can't handle recovering from this, and also we're people. We have life. Sometimes these things can't fit into our life. And in order to graduate to the point of these rides making sense, you have to fulfill all of those boxes or check all of those boxes. And so if you want to do these rides and you enjoy them and you think you're doing them, make sure you're also looking at the next few days and how you're responding to them. Are they actually being positive in your training, or are they just mission impossible missions that
Yes.
we're feeling really good about ourselves because we conquered, but not actually progressing our training forward?
I want to look at the actual data behind this, and maybe we can pull it and share it at some point here, because when we look at athletes' accounts, and we do look at this at scale as well as individually across, and remember, this is over 150 countries, like athletes all around the world, over 250 million activities in there. It's a huge amount. And the athletes, very, very few athletes actually do 3 to 5 hours. And keep in mind, these are TrainerRoad athletes. So these are not just people out like riding their townie or something. These are people that are training for something. 3 to 5 hour rides are so rare. And then those that do 3 to 5 hour rides, their workout compliance, their subsequent workout compliance, to Hannah's point, is almost always compromised after those rides. It's just a weird thing where in cycling, we think that we just need to train like the pros. When in reality, the way to get faster, eventually, maybe you get there. But the way to get there isn't just to instantly jump to it. You have to meet yourself where you're at. And that's like a really important key with this whole thing. I think it's got a lot of athletes kind of getting the cart ahead of the horse with their training for sure. And if you just focus on consistency, and I know it's not very exciting, but man, when you focus on consistency, it feels like magic on the bike. You feel so good. And that part is exciting. You know, when you actually feel like, oh, I can fly up this climb, or I dropped my friend, or I won the race, whatever it is, or I got my goal time, that feels exciting. And a lot of the time it takes just a lot of consistent work to get there. Mm-hmm. So James has a question, says, really enjoying the podcast. I have a somewhat unusual issue. Similar to others, my power, FTP, but also shorter efforts, they mentioned, is much higher on climbs than on flat roads. However, I feel the discrepancy between the two is really big. For example, 330 watts on the flat, but 370 watts on a climb. And then mentions even 389 watts according to what they've done recently on like a 5-minute effort. So like a short effort, they're able to do a lot up a climb. Even though I'm one of the larger riders at 6'5" and 185 pounds, I consistently get dropped on the flat during races and sometimes in training, and then overtake the same people as soon as that gradient gets steeper. This pattern made sense when I weighed 152 pounds as a junior racer, but with my current weight, it is really strange to be out-sprinted and dropped on the flat by people with a much lower power to weight ratio. I think that they mean like, anyways. Although I understand that aero has a lot to do with me being relatively slow on the flat, I'm really interested in your opinions on why the power difference is so big. Looking forward to hearing from you. And then a few extra points of context. I really enjoy standing for extended periods of time. I have a little bit of a red flag that goes there. Much preferred to riding seated. Then they mentioned that their power is also higher when they do this. I've experimented with position on the bike, and the power discrepancy does not really change for either type of bike or different positions. My strength is fatigue resistance. We'll get into this in a bit. My strength is fatigue resistance. For an example, I averaged 335 watts on a climb for 25 minutes after 11 hours, and this was... I don't think that 20,000... Okay, and after 20,100 feet of elevation, that's a lot. Big weaknesses are sprinting, repeated VO2 max without proper recovery between the efforts, and the extra kick on top of an effort needed to stay in to close a gap to a group in a race instead of spending endless amounts of time 50 meters behind the peloton. So Hannah, we have an athlete that puts out more power on the climbs, but they're big, so they think I should be better on the flats. But then they also point out that they prefer to stand. They also point out that they don't do well on short, hard efforts or anything that's repeated. Where does your head go on this one in terms of what could be causing this scenario for this athlete now they can fix it?
So there's a few different things to talk about here for sure. I don't even know where to start. Okay, I'm just going to dive in.
Yeah, let's do it.
First of all, this is actually a really common issue. This isn't, I hear this all the time from athletes is, I can hold more.
It's the most common.
It's so common. That's why so many of us go to hills to achieve our targets on climbs.
Yeah.
But
you almost never hear of the opposite, right? Where a person's like, in fact, I've never heard of it, where a person's like, I just can't do power on the climbs, but I can on the flats. I've never heard that.
Yeah, and most people will have a preference. It might be trained. Like if you live somewhere without any climbs, you might feel awkward when you go somewhere and climb mountains. But regardless, most everyone will have a preference. It usually is climbing for hitting intervals. And this is actually a physics issue and a kinetic energy issue and an inertia issue. So there's all kinds of very complicated physics equations that I do not understand, nor will I get into. But the bottom line is that you actually pedal differently in these two scenarios. And it's barely noticeable or not noticeable at all to your own sensations. And there have been studies like in labs using EMGs, which is essentially monitoring your muscle firing while exercising. And what they see in this is that in flats and in climbing, even at the exact same cadence, your muscles are firing differently. And it's because of the low kinetic energy versus the high kinetic energy. So on flats, when you're moving very quickly, which is typically quicker on flats than on climbs, you're moving at a high kinetic energy. So if you stop pedaling, you'd keep going. That's how we know it's high kinetic energy. And in this scenario, you might be doing the same cadence and you might be putting out a similar power. But because you're moving so quickly, the way that you're pedaling is actually basically topping off the speed. Because you're already moving so fast, you're topping off the speed with each pedal stroke. So the amount of force you're putting into the crank is a shorter duration time, but harder. You're putting in more force, shorter period of time, equals same power. In a climbing scenario, because the kinetic energy is so low, you have to maintain greater force throughout the entire pedal stroke. So you have a longer duration of force throughout the pedal stroke, which might feel actually, like we're saying, more natural because when you're working hard, it makes sense to have that muscular engagement the whole time rather than the discomfort of that really hard, fast effort with each pedal stroke that we need to get into the rhythm of on a fast-moving flat road. This is also why you can get into, it's a little bit complicated exactly how it works, but without getting too much into the weeds, you can understand that this is a difference of, like we talked about earlier, fast twitch muscle fibers versus slow twitch muscle fibers, which then once again makes sense why you're saying you need to work on your repeated VO2 efforts or you're not that high at sprinting. You need to be doing high cadence drills to be more efficient at pedaling. All of these things, if you work on them, you will simultaneously get better at riding flats. I think the other issue that we encounter here just from a training perspective, before I let Jonathan get into some of the fatigue resistance issues here, which are definitely glaring as well. But all of these things are important because I think for some reason, again, almost like we just talked about, there's this very pretty, shiny thing about being like, oh, I'm so good at climbing because climbing is considered the hard thing. And so I think sometimes we almost don't work on flats because we don't feel like it's as good to be good at, which doesn't really make sense. But I think it is a reality. And so I would encourage you to challenge yourself because this will hold you back. It is holding you back. That's why you're writing into a podcast. And so This is something that you do need to work on it because it is different. You are more accustomed to one than the other. And just like everything else in training, you get good at what you do. And so you
Yes.
need to start riding flats and you need to start working on these things, because if you do it, it also will get better. It isn't something you're stuck in forever. You might have a certain affinity to one, but you can improve at both. So that's my encouragement to you.
Yeah, that was great advice, Hannah. And great place to start with that is tempo and sweet spot intervals on the flats, like especially on the tempo side to start out and then work your way into sweet spot. James, you mentioned that it doesn't look like you have a TrainerRoad account or anything else. So I'm not sure like what your coach is giving you or if you have a coach or anything else, but tempo and sweet spot work on those flats will really do a good job of introducing you to it. I personally do endeavor, because I've never once encountered like, man, I just can't do that power on the climb. Like I've never encountered it. So I actually try to do all of my interval training if I can on relatively flat roads. Like they can be rolling, but not just going on a climb. There are some like differences that I'll do in some cases. Like yesterday was a short 2-minute VO2 sort of a thing. And it was going to be a lot easier to do that because it had 6-second sprints every 30 seconds within a 2-minute VO2 interval. It was
hard.
It was like I was breathing razor blades at the end. And it was in like 100-degree heat and stuff. It was gnarly. That one, I thought I'd have a little bit too much momentum after the 6-second sprint, and it might be hard for me to catch up depending on the wind direction I was going. I might like spin out for a little bit when I should be riding at VO2 in between those sprints. So anyways, there's kind of like some artistry to that. But the point is that you want to start to shift your way over to trying to do that on the flats, or you ride the trainer in a high gear. It's not going to be exactly the same, but drop all the way down to your 11 tooth or your 10 tooth or whatever you have with your big ring. And that will do a pretty good job if your trainer in particular has like a flywheel weight, like a significant one, like a Saurus H3 or anything else. That will do a pretty darn good job of simulating that feeling, like Hannah said, where you're not forced to be putting out force for all 360 degrees of the pedal stroke. Instead, what you'll be doing is be kind of like spiking more of that force for just a shorter portion of that 360 degrees. So that's one way that you can work on it practically. At 330 watts, flat out, you are more powerful than the vast majority of cyclists, and that's in the flats. At 370 watts, you are much stronger in terms of power output than almost every cyclist. And you can see that if you sign up with TrainerRoad, you can actually see like your power records compared to other people of your age group and everything else. And you can see that. And I guarantee you will be in rarefied air. You will be up there with the really, really high power athletes. So you do mention just kind of like it as a passing on the aerodynamic side. And I am inclined to lean into this a little bit and think like there probably is some sort of issue maybe with that, but also likely with your positioning and your efficiency with a group and your ability to anticipate and read what a group is going to do. Because it doesn't matter if you have a 500 watt FTP, if you're always in the wrong spot or you don't understand how a race is going to move and how momentum works in a group, then you're going to make it really hard on yourself. So there are probably a lot of things to learn there that can be learned through group rides racing, watching YouTube videos of crit races, doing all that stuff. You can check out our YouTube channel for that, and you can really kind of learn a whole lot from there. The fatigue resistance point that you brought up, Hannah. So you mentioned that you have good fatigue resistance because you were able to put out a lot of power at the end of this really long ride. You probably do because of good training. Have because fatigue resistance is an outcome that you want of any sort of good structured training plan like we talked about here. So it's probably there. But at the same time, I wouldn't say like a key component of fatigue resistance is like your ability to be able to put out power in like sustained load for long periods of time. And a great way to build muscular endurance in that regard is through doing these intervals on flats. Like, it's just a fantastic way to be able to do it. I think there's some sort of strange interplay, and I don't pretend to understand everything in terms of this like shorter duration, higher peak of force perhaps versus longer duration, more steady force in terms of, which muscle fibers are getting tagged into the ring and which are jumping out at which specific points. I don't know, but I can say that practically speaking, when athletes are doing their intervals in the flats and they're able to maintain that power on the flats, that sort of a thing, those are usually very durable athletes. They're the sort of athletes that can deal with a lot in a race. So you said that you were able to do this at the end of the race, and that part of me makes me think like maybe a lot of this does come down to just really bad positioning and aerodynamics. I'm not sure. But at the very least, like what Hannah was talking about here, I really do think that you can't underestimate how important it is to do the work in the context that you'll be doing it on, whether it's climbing or flats. And climbing, again, if you were to tell me like you can only pick climbing or flats, I would pick flats every day because I know it's going to make me faster for the climbing. Would I pick that out of my own volition in terms of what's easiest? No, but I would pick that because it would better prepare me for a variety of scenarios.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, hopefully that's helpful, but a part of me does wonder how much of this is, aerodynamics and positioning, because I'm sure you've seen it, Hannah, like when you first got into gravel racing and you were in triathlon before, so you had some drafting experience there, but then, mountain biking was your main thing. Then suddenly you're into these gravel races, and you've mentioned this on the podcast before, how much of a learning curve that was.
Still
like
learning
pack dynamics, and it's hard.
It is hard.
It's like beautiful to watch a rider that's really good at reading a field, because they're able to play the whole thing like their own instrument, and they're just able to just work with it.
And what's hard about it is you don't really get the immediate feedback. In some ways you do, but in some ways you don't, because I think we're really trained as athletes where if you get dropped, it's like, oh, I wasn't strong enough. But that's not always the case in pack racing. It could be you were in the wrong spot for too long and then you were too tired when the move actually came. So no, you weren't strong enough for that move, but it wasn't because you weren't strong enough for that move. It's because you were tired from the previous. There's just so many things that it really takes practice, because the first couple times you experience it, you might leave just scratching your head thinking, what just happened? Like, I'm looking at my numbers and I'm looking at the numbers of the winner, and my numbers are stronger than their numbers, and how did I not win? And they sat in really smart. They used it when it counted. And so, yeah, I think there's a huge amount to that. And one other note I want to make on the climbing and the fatigue resistance as well is, unless you're doing these climbs that are like an hour and a half long, which we don't have that many of those, just geographically. So unless you live in one of those places that have those, you're likely also spending significant periods of time in your ride coasting, even if it's between interval sets. And that is also limiting your ability to create the fatigue resistance versus if you're doing an hour-long tempo and you're doing it on a climb and you're looking at normalized power instead of average power because, oops, I have to descend in the middle of this, it's not the same as sustaining that exact power for an hour on flat terrain. And so I don't know what climb you're using. I don't know if that's the case, but it is something to consider if what you're doing is essentially hill repeats rather than a sustained effort up a very long climb.
And something that breaks down the fatigue resistance thing is you mentioned that repeated VO2 max without proper recovery between the efforts is a limiter for you. And you mentioned that an extra kick on the top of an effort in order to stay into the group and close a gap is a limiter for you. If you have good fatigue resistance, those two things will actually be a relative strength for you. So it's, again, fatigue resistance is the hot topic, and maybe it's being misunderstood or misapplied here. In this case, if you have a weakness of sprinting, repeated VO2 max efforts, being able to push hard that all sounds to me like perhaps what you have is a situation, I don't know what your training looks like. If you aren't doing those sort of efforts, then you need to. There's a lot of situations where an athlete can actually have like a pretty high threshold. But as soon as they get right at that threshold or cross it, and I know somebody's going to say that's not FTP, but in reality, they can ride at like 90% of their FTP for a disproportionately high amount of time. But then when they cross that, it's really short-lived. In a very outsized way, it's very short-lived. And there's a situation where if athletes are not, it's commonly said that to raise your threshold, you need to lift from the bottom and pull from the top. And if you do, those are two different ways to raise your threshold. And if you're just lifting from the bottom and you're not pulling from the top, you can make it so that your body actually operates at a high percentage of threshold very efficiently. But then as soon as you cross it, and if your body dumps a lot of lactate and your body isn't used to being able to reprocess that and still be able to allow an optimal environment for your muscles to work, then as high as your FTP might be, you're kind of stuck. So this is kind of sounds like that might be the issue. I don't know how much specific work you're doing with over threshold work here, where you're focusing on cycling lactate and going through, or shuttling lactate, forgive me, where you create it and then you give your body the chance while still under load to be able to clear it. And then you repeat and you repeat and you repeat. That's the sort of work that can really help, and then maybe even lift your threshold. It's clear that your threshold is very high, relatively speaking, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, and it has really no bearing at meaning how functional you are above that threshold. And that sounds like it's kind of the limit here. And maybe if you're on the flats and you have to, like, the other thing is probably, I don't know, maybe this is pseudoscientific. You let me know, Hannah, but when you're rolling at a high speed on the flats and you come across a wind gust, you come across an acceleration, you come across a slight hill, it's like to be able to maintain your speed, it requires exponentially more power the faster your speed is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is going slow and they sprint, you actually don't have to put out like as much power and as much force to maybe latch onto them. Whereas at high speed, if you're already riding at, you need to be holding 280 watts to be able to hold the speed you're doing. To respond to anything more than that instantly is going to push you over your threshold.
Mm-hmm.
So, and whereas on a climb, it may not be quite the same. You may be able to respond a little bit better. And that's another thing. With more speed, there's more wind resistance. There's a lot of different things to overcome. And as a result, it might be just you're really good below your threshold, but not good above it. And all those little efforts when you're going faster just have an even greater, like, high number that you need to put out in terms of power. So, I don't think it's that you have great fatigue resistance. Otherwise, you'd be like, I'm great at repeated VO2 max efforts. And instead, it might be one of these situations where you have like really good fractional utilization is what they call it. Like you can ride at a high percentage of your threshold, but over threshold, it's just you're out of your element, you know. That could be it, at least. I don't know if we've missed any details there. And hopefully all that helps. You could just sign up for TrainerRoad and it'll take care of it for you. Not so subtle plug, James. So... okay, I think we have time for one more, Hannah. Is that good?
Let's do it.
Cool. Okay, let's do it. This one comes from Aaron. Aaron says, hey, TrainerRoad team, I'm hoping you can help me figure out how to pace on single track with the power meter. I feel like we have the perfect person to talk about this, Hannah. Which this might be a bit of like a... It's not really possible, but we'll see.
Abstract.
Yeah. Aaron says, some background. I've been using TrainerRoad for 1.5 years and have definitely gotten stronger. My FTP went from 179 to 245. Holy cow, that's a big increase. Last year, I used TrainerRoad to train for the Park City Point to Point, which is 75 miles of mostly single track. Absolutely. Between 10,000 and 11,000 feet of climbing. I made it 53 miles before missing the cutoff last year. This year, I'm training for the point to point again, which, by the way, point to point.
It's a hard race.
What? Oh, that is such a hard race. All right. I tried it once, and that was too soon after a concussion, and I had to pull. If you can finish point to point, you are that's rare. That's a very high bar. That race is very difficult. Mm-hmm. So. This year, I'm training for the point to point again in the Leadville 100. I'm not racing either of these races competitively. I just want to finish them. Now on to the issue I've been facing. Last year, I spent way more time on the trainer doing intervals than I did outside riding trails. And while the trainer made me stronger, I ended up feeling pretty unprepared with upper body fatigue and pacing during the point to point race. This year, I'd like to be able to spend a decent amount of time on single track alongside my structured intervals so I can get better at pacing and prepare my body for the physical demands of the point to point and Leadville 100. I will note that I have incorporated strength training into my training this year too. That's great. That's good to hear. Good job there, Aaron. Aaron says, my main issue is that I can't consistently stay in my endurance zone on mountainous single track. I'm constantly pushing 200 to 400 watts on punchy climbs. I've tried going slower, but then I'm grinding up hills in a low cadence, which increases leg fatigue. I've tried increasing my cadence, but my power still seems to stay high. I also recently dropped to a smaller chainring. I'm riding a 1x12 with a 30-tooth chainring and a 1051 in the back. I've searched online, but all the advice focuses on increasing watts. So here's my question. How can I put out fewer watts while climbing on single track? I understand that riding endurance rides on easier trails on the trainer would be more beneficial for my overall fitness, but if I don't figure out how to pace on the very trails I'll be riding during the point-to-point, I'm going to bonk just like I did last year. Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Feel free to analyze my calendar and rides. So in this case, Aaron, I've looked through your calendar and everything else. Great consistency. You're doing great with your training. That's all solid there. And Hannah, this question here, it says, how can I put out fewer watts while climbing on single track? I feel like the problem with single track is that it's not built for even pacing. It's not, you can't. Within reason, you can't, right?
Yeah, I think in some ways these are the same question and also two different questions. So to first address the pacing situation, it is going to be somewhat abstract. So for example, when I do something like the FKTs that I've done, which is a time that I'm completely in control of my pacing, my coach gives me pacing for the sustained periods of time. And then when I am riding something that's technical or in single track, I can't hold so tightly to those numbers. I have to then rely on RPE. And that in and of itself is a skill. I think that because as athletes, we focus so much on watts in training that we become very afraid of RPE in racing, which to some extent you should be. Like if you're racing a time trial, we've talked about it enough on this podcast, don't go based on RPE. You're just making, again, like it's a skill. It makes it harder on you. Use the objective data that you have when it makes sense. But on single track, it's not going to make sense. You're always going to be chasing the number because it might be 0 and then 200 and then 12. And like it's going to be all over the place and you're going to be chasing it. So every pedal stroke is going to be off because you're going to be trying to make up from the last one. Instead, we then have to come in to our body's sensations and really focus on things more like our breathing. How am I breathing? Can I hold a conversation? How hard does this feel? Does it, like, I feel like for me, I can close my eyes at this point in my career and know exactly what a sustainable breath sounds like for me. What is that metronome that I can sustain? And when is it too high where I know, ooh, this effort is limited? And that's something you have to practice and get used to, but it's also something that during the race, you can constantly check in with yourself. Typically, like the simplest way put, if you're riding aerobic, you can chat. And that's something we can check on, you know? Mm-hmm. In point to point in particular, there's several single track sections that, I mean, point to point's basically my backyard. I rode these trails yesterday, you know? So I understand that it's hard to maintain perfectly, but it is still relatively smooth where you can check, oh, yeah, I could hold a conversation. We're doing okay. And so that's where I would encourage you on these long climbs that are in point to point. That's when you're looking at your power. In the single track sections, that's where you're listening to your body. You're listening to your breathing. And then to get into your second question more directly, how can I put out fewer watts while climbing on single track? This is a part of pacing, but it's also a part of skill training or technical ability. Because if you're coming, one of the issues actually might be that you're trying to pace so hard that you're coming into these steep sections so slow that if you're going so easy coming into a steep section, you're going to have to go so hard to get up it that you are going to spike to a place where, oh my gosh, now I can't recover by the time the next one. And now your heart rate is consistently elevated. So one of the things you want to do in single track when there are little steep pitches is carry your momentum. That doesn't mean sprinting into it, but if you have like a downhill into an uphill, this is where shifting down before it is so important, because if you hit it bogged down, you can't shift on it, and boom, now you're cranking up this hill and it is so hard. Carrying momentum. You also want to start pedaling sooner. Again, if you coast all the way halfway up the hill and then start pedaling, you're going to be coming from a dead stop, and it's going to be way harder. And so it's not just about, what did Aaron say on here? I'm trying to go slower, but then I'm grinding up hills in a low cadence. I've also tried increasing my cadence, but my power stays high. It's about increasing your cadence when the load is smaller. So it's about increasing that cadence on the slight flat or on the downhill before you hit that big uphill, so that you have that speed and momentum to use as little energy as possible to get up it.
Aaron, I'm looking at a ride right now, and Hannah, I should be sharing my screen, but we'll add this in post. It'll be magic for people. Producer Rob will do that. Recent ride in Park City where they went up through Deer Valley, checking out some of the Park City point-to-point course. For the whole climb, you had 33% of your time in zone 1, 23% of your time in zone 2, 10% in tempo, 3% in sweet spot, 3% in threshold, 3% in VO2 max, 2% in anaerobic. That's brilliant.
I was going to say, that sounds really good.
So good.
Yeah.
It's great. It looks like a wonderful graph. So I think that here's a potential, like this is me taking liberty of just assuming things. Sometimes we think it's that we didn't like we can't stay in the zone. But in reality, what it comes down to is a lot of it is our technical abilities really like limit us on a race like Park City point to point, where it's almost all single track, like almost all. I think they like pride themselves. It's always like under 2% or something.
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say it's 90 something percent single track. Yeah.
Yeah. So when it's like that all the time, you have to be on the whole time. And it's really easy if your brain gets fatigued or your body and you lose some of that, which you mentioned, that was like a barrier that you had. Now you're doing strength training, you're doing all this other stuff. That's awesome. You're spending time on single track. It looks like you're really diligent with your midweek workouts on the trainer, then you're outside on the trails on the weekend. That's great. But it is amazing how much energy you can bleed when you take bad lines or are in the wrong body position, and it kills your momentum. It makes it so that you turn kind of robotically, and a round turn turns into a 4-point turn. And every time you have to turn a round, smooth turn into a 4-point turn, that's 4 points when you could have lost traction, and you're increasing the likelihood that you could. So you were carrying more tension, you were hitting your brakes more, and before you know it, you are losing like pretty significant percentages on every turn. And then what you do is you have to make up for it with more effort later on. And then there becomes a bit of like a self-perpetuating cycle if you start to look at your power when you're not riding smooth like that, because like Hannah said, it says 400 then 12, and then like it's all over the place. So then you think the problem is I'm not pacing right, but in reality the problem is you're not in a spot where you can be smooth and trust your position to be able to deliver momentum and control. Like momentum and control, those are the two things that you're balancing constantly with single track, right? And it's you need to find your skills and your technique, everything else, that will allow a certain amount of speed on a trail. And as you level that up, that will make it so that you can do that with less energy, and then maybe even raise that speed even higher. And I know from, again, I haven't completed point to point, but from everybody that I've spoken to that's done that race, at the end of that race, it's so hard to just ride on single track because you're fried, because it's nonstop all day. So I think that a lot of this comes down to like very focused training on aiming to be smooth on the trails. And what smooth looks like is good line choice. That means when a single track takes you on a path, a lot of the time we think that the only spot I can be on a single track is the center of the single track. If you follow a rider like Hannah, you're going to see that Hannah explores the space a bit more. Hannah's going to be coming in and looking to enter as wide as she can in most cases. She's going to allow herself to drift to the inside at the apex, and she's going to allow herself to drift wide at the end. That little bit actually makes a pretty profound difference when you're dealing with XC tires that don't give you great traction. She's also going to come into turns, and instead of looking to slam on the brakes, like she mentioned, she's going to shift down a few times coming into that turn, not wait until the turn. She's going to maybe coast into the turn and then ease on the power instead of just slamming on the power when she goes through turns. It all looks very effortless when you see a really good athlete do it, and it all adds up. And you can practice it though. You don't have to be a Hannah to be able to do that. You just have to practice, and then you'll improve from wherever you're at. And I think a really good way to do this, especially, I'm just going to speak specifically to Erin in this situation. You do a lot of your training and riding in Park City. You have Round Valley. That's a network out there that's really drifty, easy to lose traction on, but you can do circuits. Like you can do the same thing over and over. Go find something where you can do the same thing over and over. Challenge yourself to not raise your power, but decrease your time.
Mm-hmm.
And if you make that your goal, to look at your power, like, I don't want to put out any more power, but I want to see myself drop my time. Another way to do it is to spend less time coasting or less time above a certain amount of power, like above threshold. But while doing that, make sure that your time is dropping. And if that's happening, it's likely because you're being more smooth. And I think that's a great way to use data to kind of like drive you into this way to kind of working through and working on it. And if you haven't worked with a skills coach, work with one and specifically ask them, I want to be able to carry more momentum through single track. It doesn't have to be extra technical. I just want to be more confident with maintaining my momentum and traction when it's tricky to do that. And they'll probably work with you on like bike body separation, cornering position, dropping your outside foot, leaning your bike, and looking through turns and doing a lot of that stuff. And it'll just be a huge help. So, Hannah, you have any other thoughts on that one?
I think we covered it. I mean, the bottom line is if you're spending a lot of your time riding in Park City, you have the best case scenario because you can go and you can practice all of the trails in point to point. So have fun practicing those, and you have the opportunity to test without consequence. Like if you didn't live there, it might be scary to go into the race and pace certain sections based on RP because what if you blow up? Well, beforehand, go and pick one of the trails. Go ride up Armstrong based on RPE.
Yes.
And see how that manifests afterwards in power and see if that is a viable option for you. And that's how we practice. So you have the perfect scenario to nail this race. I'm excited for you, Aaron.
You do. You have trails in that area that, like, I guess mid-mountain still goes up and down, but there are a lot of trails that traverse that whole region that just kind of contour. Those are really good ones to practice on too, so as long as they're not too crowded. Hannah, thanks a bunch for coming on. What's your next race?
I'm racing XCM National Championship.
Ooh, which is it in Alabama again?
It's in Virginia. It's in Roanoke.
Virginia. That's it. Yes, in Roanoke, Virginia. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Exciting.
Yeah.
That's pretty soon, right? It's just a couple weeks away.
Yeah, less than 2 weeks away.
Oh, wow. That's exciting. So I'll be, I think, doing the death ride while you're doing that, I think. Yeah. Or no, by the time they listen to this, I'll be doing Tahoe Trail 100, I think, while they do that. So cool. We're going to talk more about that on another podcast coming up, and I'll do like a separate podcast talking all about like my training and the prep. It'll be really fun. Stay tuned for that. If you want to become a faster cyclist, TrainerRoad, it's AI cycling coaching. It does all the hard work for you. You just, well, not all of it. It won't pedal for you, but it takes care of all the details. So you can just train how you want and still get faster. Zwift rides, group rides, solo rides. You can have a customized training calendar and you never have to do FTP tests. It uses AI to do that for you. It's amazing. We got lots of exciting stuff we're working on. Go check it out. And go check out Hannah's Instagram as well. It'll be, you'll be able to go on there, catch up and see all the different things she does. Go support competitive cyclists, Scott Bikes, all the different companies that Hannah works with. And you can go to her Instagram profile and see where they are and support all of them too. With that, we'll talk to you all next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.